Every year, we look forward to Chris's talk. Because, Chris, you teach us so much in these few moments with you, it's kind of like taking a master class in just one session. We shared last year, and I want to remind us all again, not that we would ever forget, that we have renamed this talk, which I think will always be known as Chris's talk, but in memory of your beloved Rhoda. That it is a lecture in her memory, because so much of the work that you do, Chris, is also the work that she did as a student and teacher of history. We are your students. Teach us your words of Torah.
I am indeed honored to once again have been asked to make some remarks at this point in the Yom Kippur service. Our tradition commands us that on this day we are to reflect on our own sins, but also to take some time to consider the vastly greater sins committed against the Jewish people. Sins committed against us for 2,000 years, which reached their greatest and most tragic intensity during the Shoah. And I am certainly deeply moved by the decision our rabbis made last year that this portion of our service shall be known as the Rhoda Friedrichs Memorial Lecture. My wife Rhoda was born in the safety and security of New York City in 1946. But her life was deeply imprinted by the Shoah. She knew from her earliest years that her father, a Jewish doctor in Berlin, had survived only because he escaped from arrest by the Gestapo and made his way perilously to New York. She knew also, and knew only too well, that her maternal grandparents had not been able to leave Germany in time and had been murdered, one in Auschwitz, the other in a small Nazi transit camp known as Ibiza. In the 68 years of Rhoda's life, the Shoah was never far from her thoughts. Some years ago, she wrote a powerful article for Zachor, the newsletter of our Vancouver Holocaust Education Center, about how deeply the awareness of her grandparents' absence had imprinted her life. Rhoda was a strong supporter of Holocaust awareness education. To name this portion of our Yom Kippur service in her memory is deeply fitting. As Rhoda and I sat together at this very service 2 years ago, we could not have known that her name was not to be inscribed in the book of life for the coming year. But her memory remains a blessing for me, my family, and for all who knew her. Yet my thoughts of late have also turned to the memory of another Jewish woman, a woman a generation older than my wife or I. This woman was named Nellie Bruel. She lived in the German town of Braunschweig, or Brunswick, as we would say in Canada, and her early years were untouched by any episodes of anti-Semitism. Her aspiration was to be an elementary school teacher, so she enrolled in the education faculty of Braunschweig's small university. As part of her studies, like education students today, she was assigned to be a student teacher in a variety of elementary schools around the city. She loved it. In her diary, which she carefully preserved and which still exists today, She reported repeatedly with enthusiasm about these practica. The children were delightful. I was astonished when the hour was already up. The class behaved perfectly. I enjoyed the teaching enormously. The children paid such close attention and understood everything, and so on. And everybody knows that when a teacher has enjoyed a class so much, it means that the kids were enjoying it too. Did any of them know, or if they did know, did any of them care that Fräulein Bruel was Jewish? Almost certainly not. This was 1930, 1931. She was simply that nice student teacher. But then came 1933. Everything changed. Within months, Nellie Bruel was banished from the university. Teaching in public schools was now impossible for her. She made a modest living teaching in special schools for Jews and giving English lessons to other Jews who hoped to emigrate. She too hoped to emigrate from Germany, and finally she did. In 1937, she and her non-Jewish fiancé managed to get out of Germany and get to New York, where they married and began a family. I was a product of that marriage, the fourth child of Kurt and Nellie Friedrichs, born in New York in 1947. My mother was among the lucky ones, able to leave Germany in time and create a new life in the United States. Many, many others were not so lucky. They waited too long, or they didn't have the right papers or the correct visa or the money for tickets. They stayed in Germany, and we know only too well what happened to almost every one of them. How often have I pondered what might have happened to my mother if she had not been able to leave Germany? And I have wondered in particular what might have happened on the streets of Braunschweig if she had come across any of those youngsters who had so enjoyed her lessons a few years earlier. By the late 1930s, even before the Jewish star was ordained, everybody in a small town like Braunschweig knew who the Jews were. Would any of those former students have greeted Fräulein Bruel if they saw her walk by them on the street? I doubt it. For by the late 1930s, a new subject had been added to the curriculum of every German school. Its official name was racial science. But we can give this new subject a simpler and clearer name: hate. For within just short years, every pupil in every German school had been taught to hate Jews. Yes, some hate was left over for the Slavs, for the Roma and Sinti, for the mentally and physical disabled, and for many other groups. But the overwhelming amount of hate was directed against Jews. Children were taught to regard every Jewish man, woman, and child as an inferior being, subhuman in fact, but also at the same time as extremely dangerous. For while in this teaching the Jews scarcely deserved to be called human, they were apparently also smart enough to create a worldwide conspiracy designed to undermine the civilized life of the German people. Every single Jew was a menace to every German. Children were especially dangerous, since they would live the longest. Jews were to be shunned, avoided, scorned, and eventually deported to who knows where, so that nice communities like Braunschweig would become Judenrein. About 20 years ago, a historian named Daniel Goldhagen published a widely discussed book called Hitler's Willing Executioners. Some historians thought it was a very good book. Some thought it was a very bad book. I was among the small minority of historians who thought it was, well, somewhere in between. Goldhagen did something very important in this book. In meticulous detail, he demonstrated that no matter how much the Nazis hated other ethnic or religious or social communities, their hatred for Jews always surpassed their hatred for any other group. And this took very concrete forms. In the camps, if other prisoners got 600 calories a day, the Jews only got 400 calories. On death marches, if non-Jews were allowed to stop at a well and drink water, Jews were blocked from doing so. This had never been documented quite so clearly before. But how did Goldhagen account for this? Here's where his book became problematic. For Goldhagen was apparently so shocked that an allegedly civilized people could turn to what he called exterminationist anti-Semitism, that he could only imagine that this was the product of 400 years of steadily increasing hatred, something that had begun with Martin Luther and reached its culmination 4 centuries later with Adolf Hitler. But Goldhagen was wrong. It did not take the German people 400 years to reach the point where soldiers and policemen and SS men willingly, openly, eagerly participated in the mass murder of Jewish men, women, and children and bragged about it, bragged about what they were doing in letters they sent home. It took less than a decade. Of course, there was anti-Semitism in Germany in 1932. But it was not necessarily sharper or more intense than the anti-Semitism that prevailed at that time in many other countries, in France, in Britain, here in Canada. It was only when what had once been a tiny fringe party, the Nazis, came to power and began to indoctrinate the German people in their theories of racial superiority and their program of racial cleansing that things actually changed. Hate is actually remarkably easy to teach. In the case of Germany, it took just 6 years. By 1939, the children who had once so enjoyed Fräulein Bruell's lessons had been taught that one did not talk to a Jew or offer an old Jew a seat on the tram or buy from a Jewish store. And when the Jews were rounded up and sent away, one did not ask where they had gone. Who cared? The main thing was that your town was now free of Jews. For the last 40 years, an important educational event has taken place every May in Vancouver. The annual symposium about the Holocaust for high school students from all over the Lower Mainland. 500 students come the first day, another 500 students the second day. It is an intense experience for all of them. Many of them already know quite a bit about the Holocaust. But here they see films one cannot show in classrooms. Here they listen to survivors tell their stories. Here they can ask the survivors and educators deeply challenging questions. For the last 15 years or so, I've been asked to give the opening lecture at this event. I stand in front of 500 typical British Columbia students of every heritage and background: Chinese, Korean, Filipino, South Asian, all the other ethnicities of our diverse province. And I try to make what happened to 6 million Jews meaningful to them and their lives. Of course, I contextualize the Holocaust as only one of the many episodes of mass murder that so horrendously blemished the history of the 20th century. And then I try to explain what particular features of the Holocaust made it, among all these other forms of unspeakable inhumanity, such a uniquely distinctive event. But as I approach the end of my talk, I try to explain to these students why learning specifically about the Holocaust should matter to them in their everyday lives. And this is part of what I say to them. We know a lot about what happened in the Holocaust. But why did it happen? That sounds like a very difficult question, and in some ways it is, but the basic answer is surprisingly simple. The Holocaust happened because people, not just in Germany, but all over Europe, had been encouraged or persuaded or convinced to believe in a certain kind of idea, a certain way of thinking. It is the idea that some people are better than other people, not because they have better personal qualities, but simply because they belong to a superior social or ethnic or religious group. And it is the idea that all the members of some other group are simply inferior, that their language and culture and beliefs are intrinsically less valuable than those of the dominant group. And therefore, the members of that inferior group should have their language or their culture wiped out, or indeed, ultimately, the very lives of the members of that group should be taken from them. Genocide happens because some people have been taught to despise other people. Not because of who they are, but because of the group they belong to. Now, it is a fact of life that everyone has negative or hostile feelings about some other people. And the simple truth is that sometimes those negative feelings are entirely justified. For in fact, not every human being is good. Some people are bad. Some people are profoundly bad and dangerous to others and do immensely harmful things. Individuals who do bad things or persuade other people to do bad things should be identified, arrested, put on trial, and if they are convicted, they should be put in prison or in some other way be isolated from the rest of society so that they can do no more harm. But while there may be bad and dangerous individuals, there is no such thing as an inherently bad or evil or dangerous racial or ethnic or religious group. Nobody should be punished, persecuted, let alone murdered, simply because they happen to belong to a particular group. That is the real lesson of the Holocaust. What can happen if you treat somebody a certain way, not because of anything they have actually done, but simply because of the group they were born into or belong to. Because the minute you start assuming that all the members of a particular group of people are less worthwhile than the members of some other group, the minute you start assuming that somebody's heritage or culture or language or way of life is intrinsically inferior to yours, then you have taken the first step in the path that can ultimately lead to something like the Holocaust. I'm sure that you will agree with me that this is a useful message for 17-year-old high school students. But let's be honest about this. If this message is useful and pertinent for them, it is useful and pertinent for everyone, and that includes us. No people on earth has been sinned against more horrifically than the Jews. We recall with sorrow and grief the millions of our people who have been persecuted and murdered in ways that make the mind shudder with speechless horror. But this is also Yom Kippur, a day on which we are reminded of our own capacity to sin. And who amongst us has not given way at times to the very sin which, as I tell those high school students in somewhat different language, lies at the root of the Holocaust? The sin of labeling people, not in accordance with who they are, but in accordance with what group they belong to. To take just the most obvious example, how easy it is for us to use phrases like Muslims think, or Arabs want, or Palestinians are. But how dangerous. For that is the pathway of thought that can lead to hate, and hate can lead to even worse. Our minds tell us this, of course, but we must train our emotions to tell us this as well. To despise and pursue evildoers is not only a right, it is often an obligation. But to hate the entire category of them, whoever they may be, is quite another matter. The very machzor you are holding in your hands reminds us, in the words of the Talmud, of what our rabbis have taught, that those who are persecuted and do not persecute in turn, those who listen to insults and do not reply, of them the Torah says, they that love God are like the sun going forth in its strength. This is the lesson we must struggle to honor as we engage in the constant, unremitting effort to make ourselves like the sun going forth, so that we may be worthy of being counted among God's children on planet Earth. Shana Tova.